What we've done is we've allowed too much of what are our sovereign responsibilities to go over to the United States, which is the point that Donald Trump is making. Are you a unique species on the North American continent? Donald Trump's answer is no, you are not. You've got all these resources. We've got this great defense. You can't defend yourself. Your economy is entirely dependent on us. What makes you a country? You might as well be part of us. Become the 51st state.
Dr. Darrell Bricker, you've written that Canada is not a love story. It is a marriage of convenience. What did you mean by that?
Well, if you go back through Canadian history, that was always the case. I mean, this country came together basically because of the threat from south of the border. Should sound very familiar to anybody listening today. And we put together a country from coast to coast, basically with a lot of compromise. So it was never really set up because people were wildly in love with the idea of being Canadian at any cost. They just preferred that to being American, but under certain conditions. And John A. Macdonald's genius, to the degree that people want to cancel him these days, they're kind of missing the most important part about John A. Macdonald, which is that he had the ability to get all of these people who probably couldn't agree on anything, the colony leaders on the southern or the northern part of the 49th parallel, that maybe we would be better off as our own country. So the way that they did that was by putting in place the federation or confederation that we have here in Canada, in which we were pretty clear about the responsibilities of the federal government and joint responsibilities, but also provincial responsibilities. So he was able to unite enough, the Fathers of Confederation were able to unite enough at the federal level to create a nation, but at the provincial level, respect the local requirements of those governments to be able to govern in the spaces that they needed to. That's not rallying to the flag. That's not the French Revolution. That's not other ways that countries have come together. This is a country that's come together to meet a very particular challenge, but did it in a fairly conditional way.
Yeah, it sounds like cooperation, accommodation, compromise are sort of baked into the DNA of Canada, would you say?
Yeah, and it's one of those things that I think that people sometimes forget, that is what this country is. And that's why I say it's not a love story. It's more of a marriage of convenience where we kind of prefer this situation to any of the other situations. And people are reasonably patriotic, I guess, although that's declined considerably over the years. But it's because they prefer this because they think it works better than what the alternative is. And when Donald Trump stood up and, held up the map and said, this line here, it doesn't make any sense, we should put it all together, Canadians kind of objected to that. But the nature of their objections were kind of similar to what we saw back in, in the 1860s, which is, we don't really think so. We don't really have a strong argument as to why not, but we just don't feel like that's best for us.
So let's talk about maintaining that line. What do you think are the biggest problems facing Canada today as far as maintaining itself as a country?
Well, big and growing. I mean, the two biggest growing issues that we have are what John Ibbotson and I call in our book Breaking Point, vertical cleavages and horizontal cleavages or divisions. The horizontal ones are the ones that we're most used to. And they're the ones that relate to the jurisdictional questions, like the ones that I just noted a second ago, the glass half full situation for various provinces across the country. And what's unique about this particular situation is the Laurentian consensus and the Laurentian elite who run this country, and the Laurentian consensus, which is the program with which they run it, the way of thinking with which they run it, was basically set up to deal with one particular national unity crisis, and that was always in the province of Quebec. How do you reconcile French Canada and the needs of French Canada with the rest of the country? And so they became quite adept at that, although they nearly failed in 1995 with the referenda in Quebec in 1980 and 1995. But they're programmed to deal with that. The new cleavage that we've got from a regional perspective is the one that's most, I would say, emblematic in Alberta, but not exclusively in Alberta, in Western Canada, in which people feel very distant and hostile towards the federal government. By the way, reciprocating what they believe is the view of Ottawa towards them. And as a result of that, there are conversations happening in Ottawa about how the Federation needs to change in order to accommodate their particular needs. And by the way, the province of Saskatchewan right next door maybe doesn't get as much attention, but if you look at any of the surveying that we do here at Ipsos on any of those questions, they're fairly closely aligned with Alberta. British Columbia, particularly in places like Vancouver, they might feel differently. And Manitoba tends to be a bit more like Ontario, I would say, and it's a little bit more compromising on some of these. So it's really those two particular places. Now, they've always been issues in Canada, right since the 1880s when we fought the Northwest Rebellion. It didn't become provinces until later, and kind of last minute in terms of the way that they were set up. These are the kinds of history lessons that not a lot of Canadians hear about, but how this country came together. But that's why I like to call, and we call in the book, Western Canada. We don't call it Western Canada, we call it the Wests, because each of them have their own kind of foundational stories and their own cultures and their own realities that they're dealing with right now. But that national unity question, as it affects particularly Saskatchewan and Alberta, is one that we've had in the past, but not at the level that we have it now.
And Dr. Bricker, it shows that you have so much data on this with your work in surveys and your business and everything. I wonder if you could put a number on the risk that Canada would join the U.S. in the next few years. What might that number be?
Well, it's all conditional, right? So it depends on the conditions. So we asked a survey question last December, and it was, if you could have your full American citizenship and you could have your assets valued in American dollars, would you consider voting to join the United States? And the number in Canada, I think, was 31, which, by the way, is the same number for sovereignty in the province of Quebec right now. But among people who were younger, so under the age of 35, that number was closer to 50. And that's the other cleavage. I talked about the horizontal ones. Those are the ones we normally know. The vertical one is the other one, and it's really critical as well. And that's older Canadians versus younger Canadians. And older Canadians, the Canadian Promise really paid off for them. They achieved the life that Canada had made possible for them. So, they probably own their own home in many instances. They probably have some pension of some form. They're actually doing pretty well. And then you've got a younger group of people who are having a very, very hard time imagining that life for themselves. They might be able to imagine it. Actually, that's the wrong way to put it. They might be able to manage it, but they don't see how they're going to realize it. So when you see them saying, I would consider joining the United States, the reason is because Canada's not paying off for them in the same way that it paid off for their parents or their grandparents. And so that's the other big cleavage that we're dealing with and we address in the book.
And some of that pay off things like home ownership?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing about home ownership is when you hear people who are involved in this area, so, urban planners and, people working in government talk about this, they talk about numbers of homes, and Canadians aren't really thinking about that. What they're thinking is a specific type of home. And the specific type of home, when we go out and we ask on surveys how Canadians want to live their ideal life, they would say, my patch in the suburbs, with my backyard, my front yard, my fence where my kids and my pets can play in the back, and my driveway, and that's my patch. That's what I own. But the conversation that we now have about housing is about things like urban density and, all those kinds of things. And it's like, well, that's not what that's the type of housing people don't aspire to. It's the type of housing they endure when they're forced to because of affordability issues or work issues or transit issues or whatever. It's not what they aspire to. It's what they settle for if they can't get what they really want. And by the way, there are people who want to live in that type of environment, just not as many as I think the people in the housing world think. That image of what middle-class achievement is for younger Canadians, that type of home is a big pressure point in all of this. So it's not about the number of houses. It's not about some urban density project, which, by the way, probably won't get realized anyway because the NIMBY situation in many neighborhoods in Canada isn't really going to allow it. It's going to be incredibly controversial, and as it's controversial, the type of volume that we're talking about in new houses is difficult to realize. So, when we talk about what younger Canadians are looking for, particularly when they're starting a family and they're raising children, they don't want to live downtown. They want to live out in the suburbs. It's where they grew up. It's what they know, and it's what they aspire to. But unfortunately, we have a lot of people who are very heavily engaged in this and who get listened to a lot in terms of their views about what a city should be or what, how we should deal with the housing issue in this country, who really aren't connected with that. They want to turn downtown Toronto into Amsterdam. And one wonders if they've ever actually been to Amsterdam. Medieval streets and canals makes bicycles possible. Those tall buildings that you can turn into, other types of residences, it all makes sense there. But in Toronto, which was basically built for the car, or Montreal, which was basically built for commuters, or Vancouver is in a similar kind of situation where it's basically built for commuting. It's a different way of life that people aspire to. Yes, there will be some people who want to live downtown, but it's a lot of that would be people settling rather than saying, this is what I want.
Yeah. When you say Toronto built for the car, it makes me think of Los Angeles, which is just a huge sprawling city. And you have the phrase in your book, sprawl, baby, sprawl.
Yeah, that's
There's
John.
Logic to that.
John wrote that, and he said, "Oh, I'm sure people are going to be upset by this." And I said, "No, we keep that in because basically what we're doing is reflecting what people are telling us. This isn't just our view. I mean, it's just a recognition of the reality of what housing is in the lives of Canadians. I mean, it's their number one investment, and they think it's going to be their retirement. It's the thing that really says to people, I have achieved what I want to achieve, that middle-class status that I want to achieve, and this is what it looks like. It doesn't look like saw another article in the Globe and Mail a couple of days ago. Maybe if we take one staircase, two staircases out, and we put one staircase in the four, plex that we're going to put in downtown. It's like, yes, there will be people who want to live in that, but that's not aspirational housing.
Yeah, aspirational. That's a key word. It's not something that that people really can get emotionally attached to, maybe in the same way as traditional home ownership out in the suburbs. So a few times on my show, I've talked with a man named Peter Zion, who in 2014,
I know Peter, yeah.
Yeah,
I've never met him. I'm certainly aware of his work and an admirer of what he's been able to do.
Yeah. In 2014, he had this really hot take that maybe Canada would someday become part of the U.S. And now it's starting to be something that people are talking about more. What do you think a feasible scenario for that would be? I mean, you mentioned before if they had a chance to vote. Is it something like an annexation? Is it Quebec separating first? What would it even look like?
Who knows? I mean, now we're into the world of science fiction. I mean, we never thought that, but then again, we never thought we see a president stand up and hold up a map and say, this line, it looks like somebody drew it with a ruler. I don't understand it. This should all be one thing. And the truth is, it's funny. Somebody tweeted at me, no, we fought over that border. No, we didn't. The War of 1812 was not fought over that border. The Canada that you're thinking of didn't even exist back in 1812. Come on, just stop. And no, it was drawn between the British and the Canadians and the Americans. They decided on the 49th parallel. Yes, it's a line on the map, but all they did was colored it in and said, this is what it is. And then they disputed some of those boundaries, like 59-40 or what was it, 51-49 or whatever, 40 or fight or whatever, that presidential election that was fought over the boundaries in Western Canada. I mean, there's been some dispute over some of these things, but basically it is that. And so Trump's point was, you've got all these resources. We've got this great defense. You can't defend yourself. Your economy is entirely dependent on us. What makes you a country? You might as well be part of us. Become the 51st state. Canadians really bridled at that, and we had our elbows up. By the way, elbows up is not this. Elbows up is this. Anybody who ever played hockey knows that. This is a penalty.
It's a hockey thing.
Yes, it's a hockey thing. It's a Gordie Howe thing. They used to always talk about the Gordie Howe hat trick, one goal, one assist, and one fight. But yes. So, Trump was pointing out something that if you came down from Mars and you took a look at this and you'd say, like Peter Zihan said, why wouldn't you put all of this together? And the reason we don't put it together is because Canadians don't want it together. And for Canadians, it doesn't make sense. And they look across particularly at this time in American history, and are horrified by what they see happening over the southern border. So we've seen an increase in levels of patriotism in Canada. We've seen a big decrease in levels of travel to the United States, for example. So Canadians are kind of responding in a practical way with some of their patriotism. But how could it all fall apart? It is, as I said before, it's a marriage of convenience. And if you make it a marriage of inconvenience, it could possibly be really challenged. And you can see how it happens. I mean, Alberta legislature, the Premier Daniel Smith has made it very clear that, she has a list of demands for Premier Carney, one of them being a pipeline to Tidewater in order to, so Alberta doesn't have to continue to sell its oil at a discount. to the American market, and we can start trading with Asia. Maybe we can even build one east, which would be even more problematic, by the way, and start trading with Europe. And the federal government doesn't get that through because it's resisted by the province of British Columbia, and Mark Carney and the federal government isn't able to help Alberta realize what it needs. Donald Trump steps forward and says, we don't need all of Canada. We just need the part that's most responsible for the resources that we are most interested in, which is oil and gas and maybe some critical minerals and some other things. Maybe we'll create some sort of new situation, trade relationship with that part of Canada. Okay, well then that's the job of the federal government to work out trade relationships. What happens there? And at the same time that that's going on, the province of Quebec is due for a provincial election next October. And at the moment, the Parti Québécois, the Sovereignty Party in Quebec, is leading by double digits in the polls. It looks like they will form a government potentially in Quebec next year. And if that happens, the current leader of the Parti Québécois is committed to having a sovereignty referendum in the first term that his government has. So you've got Alberta kicking off, and you've got Quebec kicking off, and a country completely preoccupied with just trying to keep this together. We have a meddlesome interventionist individual south of the border who may decide to intervene in political terms and using his economic power, as he said, to cause even more stress in the Federation. And even if it doesn't happen, the preoccupation that it has as Canada really needs to deal with the questions that Donald Trump has raised, which are, how do you deal with your own defense? Which is going to be very expensive because we've basically been a free rider since the end of the Second World War. And how do you deal with the fact that you need to diversify your trading partners? All of this stuff gets very complicated. If we have a problem going forward as a nation, that's how it will probably happen. It won't be like one thing. It'll be all of these things kind of accumulating.
Yeah, it sounds like manipulation. When somebody is distracted by something, then it's harder for them to take care of other more personal problems.
Yeah, well, that's what I worry about. I mean, so the conversation that takes place in Canada is, Alberta separatism, that's not real. And the truth is, it's not really about Alberta separatism. Do I think that Albertans would vote to separate from the rest of the country? It doesn't really seem to have that. I mean, some of the deepest wells of patriotism in this country are actually in the province of Alberta. But under the right conditions, some really poor management by Ottawa, a really enticing offer from the United States. Conversation distracts from a lot of other things. And who knows? I mean, stranger things have happened. So that's why we wrote the book Breaking Point. We're kind of at that point where we're back to the 60s where we have to decide that we want to keep this thing together. And we're going to have to make the decisions, hard decisions about what it's going to take to do that. So the book is not about, the country is going to break up. The book is about, okay, we have to be real about what we're facing. And we have to answer that question that George Grant, who wrote a book called Lament for a Nation in 1965, interestingly, 60 years after that we're going through it again. I won't talk about what that book was about, but he had one great phrase in the book that really stuck with me and was how I started into this book, what I was thinking when we started in, which was, are Canadians a unique species on the North American continent? And if we are, what are we prepared to do to protect that? And it's going to take some pretty difficult decisions in order to make that happen. And as my co-author, John Ibbotson, has said, we've kicked too many of these cans down the road for too long that the chickens have come home to roost. And as he said, I know it's a mixed metaphor, but it's gloriously so. Mix your metaphors, do it in a glorious way. That's basically what we're talking about.
Yeah. And with this idea too, you and I talked about your book, Empty Planet, and demography. So demography may be changing in Canada. People like Zion would say that maybe Canada is getting too old to really bear the economic weight of things. So how much is demography playing into this?
Well, it's playing it in a couple of big ways. One of them is our birth rate has completely collapsed in this country. So if the United States birth rate's 1.6, Canada right now is 1.25. And, this was something that John and I wrote about in Empty Planet. I should say before Peter Zahan was writing about it. But I'll just footnote. But we do have a birth rate issue in this country. The way that we've been able to deal with that is the same way the United States has done with it, but actually more recently, more effectively is through immigration. But unfortunately, what's been happening with immigration in this country the consensus around that issue has really been challenged over the last while, and that's because of basically mismanagement by the federal government. So there's 3 million people in this country that we didn't even know were going to be here. It's not 10% of the population, but it's a pretty big chunk of the population. And that was because of a combination of people coming in as, claiming some asylum status, but also a huge influx of temporary foreign workers and students. And in the student situation, in both the foreign workers situation and the students situation, without a lot of effective management. Now, the difference in Canada and the United States on this question is that at the United States, there's a lot of questioning about the individuals who are coming in. So it's about the nature of the immigration that's coming in and how it's changing the country. In Canada, it's less about that and more about how badly the process has been managed. So what's happened is Canadians have stopped giving permission to the government to do this. So we have a collapsing birth rate, and now the thing that we have that could smooth that curve down out a little bit, immigration, is under a lot of challenge. And you don't need to take my word for this. I mean, the Carney government has tacked back significantly on this. And over the next couple of years, the Canadian population is actually going to decline after outgrowing the population of the United States in percentage terms. And that's because we've cracked back on immigration.
So with the big influx of immigration into Canada, and yet this need for patriotism to kind of keep the whole thing together, are those at odds?
Yeah, they are to a certain extent, because, I mentioned that, younger Canadians are not feeling like the Canadian promise is paying off for them. Another group of people who aren't feeling the Canadian promise is paying off for them are immigrants. In fact, we did a survey, we did an exit poll after the day of the last federal election, and we asked new Canadians who were able to vote. So it's not the most recent Canadians, it's people who actually have citizenship and are able to vote. Are you thinking of leaving the country in the next few years? And I can't remember, it was like 10 years or something, or 5 years or something like that. And 50% of them said yes, particularly young men. So it's like, okay, so it's younger Canadians too. And it's immigrants. So the people we were relying on to fill in for the kids that we're not having are thinking that this isn't paying off for them either.
Yeah. When I meet people who immigrate to the United States, sometimes I'll find that they looked forward to it, and becoming a citizen was a big event in their lives. I wonder, what is that like in Canada?
Same thing. When you interview new Canadians, some of the biggest patriots that you'll find are new Canadians. Canadian identity is a little less obvious than it is in the United States. I mean, the symbols that you buy into, the history that you accept, the national ethos is a little, I would say, more diffuse than it is in the United States, but new Canadians seem to be able to figure it out. And the big part of it is really tolerance and, letting one live as one lives. I mean, the idea that government dictates how you should do things is something that doesn't really go down well in Canada. Although we do have our government's fairly direct on a lot of things, our system of government. So it's not like laissez-faire capitalism in any stretch or anything. It's more like kind of almost like a European governing ethos. And immigrants tend to do quite well with that until fairly recently. And that's because what they felt they were going to get was going to happen for them in Canada isn't happening to the same degree as it did for maybe people even from the country that they came from, who came here a generation before.
Sure. If the potential is maybe Canada becoming part of the U.S., I wonder with immigrants, how many, if you have numbers on this, were interested in becoming a citizen in either the U.S. or Canada and ended up in Canada?
I haven't got any specific numbers on that, but my expectation is if they're thinking of leaving the place, they're probably thinking of, at least some percentage of them are thinking of that they should be leaving to go try and get into the United States. Some may be wanting to go home. Some may be looking at going to another country or whatever. But I think that if you're looking for the easiest move, it probably would be to the U.S. because it's just over the border. Although all the border crackdowns that are going on right now, I don't know how easy it. But the U.S., when you go out and you do surveys on countries that you would consider immigrating to, even though the global reputation of the United States has really declined over the space of particularly the last year, it's still seen as one of the most popular places, if not the most popular place for people who are thinking of immigrating to go to. That's leaving aside the difficulty of actually being able to execute that.
So our president gets a lot of attention. Let's maybe talk about some prime ministers in Canada. I'm curious about, Trudeau, Carney. How important is the role of a prime minister in leading Canada?
Well, incredibly important. And it's funny, we talk about the power of the president in the United States. A lot of the power that Donald Trump is bringing onto himself, a prime minister, particularly in a majority government, has a lot of that power here. in this country in the areas of constitutional responsibility that are there for the federal government. So, trade, foreign policy, anything that goes across borders in the country, they have a lot of authority. In a minority government, which we have right now, it's less, but it's pretty close to a majority government. So it's budget day here in Canada. So we'll see how bold the government is going to be. But what budget is one of those votes in which a government could potentially fall. So if there's a vote against the budget, they fall and we have an election. Although I don't think that's a very remote possibility right now. Although minority governments can fall by accident, and it's happened before. But the Prime Minister has a lot of authority.
Joe, you wrote that the Prime Minister has three big jobs: keep the economy moving, keep the country together, handle the Americans. Let's start with Justin Trudeau. How did he perform in those jobs?
I think anybody being objective about this would have to say that after 10 years of Justin Trudeau and the Trudeau government, that on all three of those questions, it would probably be a red X. The economy is definitely not doing as well, particularly when you look at things like productivity in our economy. Investments that were supposed to have paid off in terms of building new economic capacity in the country have not. And particularly the government debt and deficit have become huge in comparison to what they were for the previous administration. So if you ask Canadians about whether the economy was better back in 2014 or after 10 years of Justin Trudeau, they would look back at those days as the good old days. On national unity, well, I just walked you through where things are on that. Quebec sovereignty was basically dead under the Harper administration, and Western Canada at least felt it had a seat at the table and was listened to. Whether he made progress on things like pipelines and other things that Alberta was looking for, at least it was the province of Alberta in particular, and Saskatchewan felt like they had representation in the Harper administration that they never had under the Trudeau administration. And on dealing with the United States, Governor Trudeau, what else is there to say?
Yeah. What was the boxing match with Justin Trudeau?
It was with a senator, progressive conservative senator, Patrick Brazeau. And it was just at the start of when he was thinking of coming back to lead the Liberal Party. And he had a 3-round boxing match. And the thing is, Trudeau's a really fit guy, right? And he's thing that unless you see him in person, you don't realize he's quite tall. I mean, he's like 6'1" or 6'2". I think he's 6'2". He's a pretty big guy and he's very fit. And Patrick Brazeau was kind of a little bit of a bruiser, but anybody who knows anything about boxing is it's not about so much about strength and whether or not you look good posing in a mirror. It's about whether you actually know how to box. And Justin Trudeau quite clearly did. And given that his image was being as a bit effete and a bit of a darling, that he was able to pull that off made people think, oh, this is really interesting. It's not what I expected. So yeah, it kind of got him on track as far as getting noticed. But this was after a period of time in which the Conservatives, I mean, Stephen Harper, you would only ever see him in a shirt and tie, right? He wasn't doing that stuff. He was more of a much more serious person in terms of how he presented himself than Justin Trudeau was, and he came across as kind of a breath of fresh air of change, and it's why he won.
Yeah, I took a look at the video of that boxing match after I read about it in your book, and the reach advantage is very apparent with
Brazeau. Yeah, but I mean, Brazeau, obviously not a boxer or anything. I mean, and it's like being a fighter in hockey. It's actually technique based. It's not just strength based. I mean, yeah, it's great to have good reach and all the rest of it, but you got to know what you're doing. And Trudeau did know what he was doing, and Brazeau didn't, and it was a stupid bet for Brazeau to make.
Yeah, it's amazing how these things like a boxing match can start such a ripple effect.
You never know. I mean, we had a prime minister for a very short period of time in Canada named Kim Campbell. And her whole thing started off standing bare-shouldered with her judge's, because she was a lawyer, her lawyer's gown in front of her, obviously supposed to be naked behind it. And this woman it was a very striking picture as she was looking at you. And that started her off. It was like, wow, maybe it's time for somebody like that after Brian Mulroney, because people were really tired of Brian Mulroney.
So Trudeau said that he called Canada maybe the first post-national state. What do you think that statement had as an impact going forward and maybe into where we are now?
I think that it was really representative of the values of the people who were running that party at the start, because he said it in 2015, at the start of what they were trying to do. They really felt that way. They felt that Canada was a kind of a virtuous country that was going to take its values to the rest of the world and very much aligned itself with what was popular, I would say, on university campuses and chattering class gathering points in the bigger economies and bigger cities of the world. And they really felt like that. I mean, particularly during a period in which globalization from an economic perspective, but also from an ideas perspective had become a big thing. So his view was that, we don't have the local prejudices and things that can't open our minds up to the rest of the world. And this is something that makes Canada particularly appealing as a model to how the rest of the world should operate. Those partisan class bickerings, ethnic bickerings, and all those kinds of things that we see in other places, we don't have in Canada. We've moved beyond that. It's not just that we have a national identity as Canada. We're kind of emblematic of what the world should be. And I think at that time they sincerely felt that.
So we've established that the role of the Prime Minister in Canada extremely important, extremely influential. Justin Trudeau missing on those major points that you made, so maybe a lot to blame on him. I wonder how much of the rise of Donald Trump at the same time is to blame for Trudeau's situation and the situation of Canada.
No, I really don't think that in terms of how, Donald Trump rose in the United States. I mean, if he had been, a big influence in terms of the domestic style of Canadian politics, Pierre Poilievre would be the prime minister right now, and he's not. So maybe there was some reaction to, and definitely some reaction to Trump in terms of how they looked at how Pierre Poilievre was presenting himself in that election campaign and people being turned off by it. Although he did win 41% of the vote, Mark Carney only won by 3. So it was in reaction to rather than having an influence on, I would say, in Canadian politics. And Mark Carney being elected mainly because the people who are most concerned about free trade and most concerned about Canada's trading relationship with the United States, even though it wasn't the most important issue in the election. Cost of living was always the biggest issue. Dealing with the United States and Donald Trump was like issue number 5. It wasn't the biggest issue, but everybody who was most concerned about that absolutely voted for Mark Carney. In fact, I think in our exit poll, he had a 72-point lead over Pierre Poilievre on that. Even 15% of the people who voted for Poilievre thought Carney would do a better job. So it wasn't that the election was about the substance of dealing with our trading relationship with the United States. It was picking the best person for those people who are most concerned about that issue. Who is the best person to deal with this? And this was Mark Carney. But you can imagine another set of scenarios. Okay, if Justin Trudeau hangs on and Donald Trump gets elected, does the Liberal Party win the election? Probably not. If Kamala Harris wins the election, does Mark and Pierre and Justin Trudeau stays in? Does he win the election? Probably not. If Kamala Harris wins the election and Mark Carney is elected the leader of the Liberal Party, does he win the election? Probably not. Probably we would have a minority or a majority conservative government today in Canada, but those strange collection of circumstances created it. And you'd have to say that Donald Trump and the reaction to him was central to all of that.
For Justin Trudeau, where did he succeed?
There was a lot of things he did succeed on. I mean, one of the things that has been perennially an issue in Canada is the dealing with the Indigenous community here and reconciliation. And he was the first prime minister that really made it front and center of what his government was going to do. I think that really starting to talk in meaningful terms about climate change and what that was going to be in this country, I think was really important. I think the way that he tried to deal with Donald Trump when he was being insulted, particularly at the end of his stay in office, I think that he really did try to stand up for Canada. And some might even argue maybe even better than Mark Carney is doing right now. At least he kind of pushed back, and Mark Carney's not really been doing very much of that. Now, maybe for good reason, but Justin Trudeau at least stood up and said, I'm not going to be insulted, and that's not the way to talk about, me and my country. So there were things that he did that were positive, but the childcare, we put in place a new childcare policy, put in new benefits to reduce the number of children who, were in lower income families and the access that they had to funds to be able to pay for their situations and all the rest of it. So reduce childhood poverty. There was a lot of things that he did that were really positive. And there will be people who focus on those things. But the 3 big things for any Canadian prime minister are the 3 that we talked about. All the rest is great, but those 3 things, if you fail on those, that's how history remembers you.
Yeah. How did he impact immigration? Maybe somewhere in the middle?
No, his effect on immigration and the effect of their government on immigration was disastrous. It was our one thing that we had to deal with this issue of declining birth rates, basically due to a combination of values politics and mismanagement. We ended up taking what was an all-party consensus on the need to have robust immigration in Canada and basically taking away that belief.
What happened with the hashtag Welcome to Canada tweet?
Blew up in his face, because what ended up happening was people took him at his word and they started crossing at Roxham Road, which really started this view in Canada. And I'll explain what all that is in a second. Really started this view in Canada that this was not being well managed. So what happened was people were crossing at a non-border crossing in I think it was the Vermont-Quebec border, in which people were just showing up and crossing across, not in a border post where we have a safe third-party agreement with the United States. So basically you would turn them around and send them back, because you can't really be a refugee from the United States. But what was happening was that they weren't crossing at border crossings, they were crossing at this place, and which was not covered by the agreement. It was something that the US government didn't acknowledge. So we had to accept them. And there were thousands of people coming over the border, and there were TV cameras watching this every day. And then we would start seeing people show up in the cities, and they were overwhelming the homeless shelters. They were putting a lot of strain on city governments, and they were complaining about it. And the federal government wasn't really funding the absorption of this community in an effective way, and it really started the downhill slide, I would say, on how people regarded the management of immigration by the Trudeau government.
Yeah. So with immigration being so important in Canada, yet there is an idea, some people would say that there are too many immigrants in Canada. What, by the numbers, I mean, you're a master of data. What do you think by the numbers is the case when it comes to immigration?
Yeah, well, they're right. I mean, the reason that Canadians still think that there's too many recent immigrants in Canada is because they're right. Like I said, there's 3 million immigrants that we have in this country that government didn't really know were here. And if you look at the proportion of immigrants to Canada, I mean, the foreign-born population of Canada, I think, is now 25 or 26%. That number is in the high teens in the U.S. I mean, so the foreign-born population here is a higher percentage of the population. Now, granted, it settles basically in the cities. There's very little immigration that takes place in more rural parts of the country. It's mostly in the cities, and it's very noticeable. But as I said before, it's not so much a reaction to the immigrants themselves as it is to the effect it has on housing prices, access to healthcare, access to entry-level jobs, those kinds of things that people are sitting back saying, okay, who's in charge here? Who's managing this?
Yeah. And the immigration into Canada, I wonder too, the age perhaps older than the immigration into the US, or is that a factor?
No, it's younger population too, because a lot of them are temporary foreign workers and students coming in on visas, and overwhelmingly in Canada from India. So we don't have the southern border, Latin America, Caribbean, Central America. That's, I mean, there are groups that come into the country, but overwhelmingly they're in Canada. It's Pacific nations led by India. So it's India, the Philippines, China, places like that. It's not.
So we've started to talk a little bit about Mark Carney and how some people might see him as this alternative to Justin Trudeau, this defense for Canada. I mean, what makes him the guy who's the best defense for Canada?
Well, he looks the part. And he's got the right resume. So, he was the governor of the Bank of Canada, very accomplished scholar, did very well. He's a very typical Canadian. It's almost like the old days of the British, situation where they, go to the best schools, and it was like the old days of the British Empire when Canadians would go to the best schools in the UK, or maybe they go to Harvard, or they do whatever, and then they come back and they do things. And so he's very representative of that. And he worked in a very senior job here in Canada. He was the governor of Bank of Canada during the 2008 economic meltdown, which, by the way, was far worse in the United States than it was in Canada. We didn't have the same mortgage situation. We didn't have any banks meltdown. We didn't have any of that. But still, there was a crisis here. So Mark Carney was part of the team that led us through that. And then he went off, because he did such a good job, I guess, to be the governor of the Bank of England. And Canadians like nobody better than somebody who's endorsed by another country. Americans don't care what other countries think. Canadians do. So he came back and he had that resume. And at this time in which we were being challenged by what was going on south of the border, where it looked like negotiations and very economic, and you needed a very serious person to deal with that, he had all the right attributes. And then people would see him on television, and that's how he comes across. I mean, he comes across as a serious person. He's not inspirational in any stretch. He is like the consultant that you would hire to deal with this difficult problem. And that's why Canadians voted for him, particularly older Canadians voted for him. And so that's who he is. Now, he is impossible without the contrast to Pierre Poilievre, who was leader of the Conservative Party. And the leader of the Conservative Party came across as more of a populist. He was a more typical type of politician, very slogan-oriented, good in debates, probably, one could argue, bested Mark Carney in the debates. He had all the political skills, but he looks young. The only work he's ever really done is in politics, and he was a particularly more of an attack dog kind of politician, really more of an opposition politician, and didn't really come across as someone who was ready for this moment. He was perfect for Justin Trudeau when they wanted change, because this guy was 180 degrees from Justin Trudeau. But when you put Mark Carney in the mix, he was enough of a change from Trudeau and he was so on point for the issues that people wanted to have dealt with, and had such a presentation that aligned with that seriousness, that he put Poilievre in a difficult situation. And also Poilievre, I think Canadians would regard him, particularly the swing voters that Conservatives needed to get that next 5 or 6 points, would regard him as a bit too Trumpy in terms of the way that he communicated and how he presented himself and the issues that he focused on. Right or wrong, that's how they reacted to him. So all of that created the conditions for Mark Carney.
So for Mark Carney now, he's in this position. What is his path to lead Canada through this?
Well, this is where it gets very difficult. I've laid out some of the issues. I mean, we've also got issues on defense. We've got issues in terms of our, foreign relationships. We've got issues in terms of housing, similar to what you have in the United States. We've got productivity issues, a huge number of issues. And Mark Carney is a person whose experience is in bureaucracy and senior leadership in kind of the corporate world, in which it's very much a command and control type of situation. When you operate in a federation like Canada is, the skills are, yes, being really smart about things that need to be done, but also being a really good communicator, which Carney is, I would not say is his strong suit, but also somebody who's a real relationship builder. And, if you go back to our first prime minister, John A. Macdonald, that was his thing. He was the king of getting people to accept half a cup. I've not seen, and I don't think Mark Carney has ever been faced with that type of requirement, where you're sitting across from somebody who can say to you, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do what's in the best interest of my province. And you just saw an illustration of this with Doug Ford, in the Premier of Ontario, running that ad in the United States. And, Mark Carney not being able to stop him, and which shut down the trade negotiations with the U.S. Now, Premier Ford remembers things differently. He says he showed Mark Carney the ad. Mark Carney acknowledges it. But obviously, if you're apologizing for the ad afterwards, you didn't think it was necessarily the smartest thing to do. These are the complications of Canadian federalism and Canadian leadership.
So now for Mark Carney too, he's got a country, as we said, with many immigrants who you want to get rallied around this idea of sort of sacrificing for Canada. How does he do that?
It's a good question. What is the Canadian promise? Particularly for those people who got here and said, this isn't working out for me. I really want to go someplace else. Well, I wish I had an answer for you.
Yeah, I wonder too. I mean, what would you say are the major values of Canada?
Well, I think the single biggest value in Canada is tolerance. I mean, it's the willingness to accept people from different places, because we have to do that. I mean, we've had to do that from the beginning, because we've had to accommodate the French language in Canada. We've had to, keep Quebec a part of the federation, which has meant that we've had to, accommodation right at the core of what Canada is all about. But not just Quebec. I mean, all the other provinces in the country, we had to do the same thing. So the reality with all of that is that tolerance is a really important thing for anybody in the country. But tolerance doesn't mean, intolerance. You're not allowed to have intolerance with intolerance. So it'll be interesting to see how it is always interesting to see how people accommodate themselves to those things, particularly people who come from places that aren't necessarily part of that Commonwealth British kind of Western tradition. Now, India certainly is, but there are other places that people are coming from that it's not necessarily where they come from. So it's going to be an interesting accommodation for them too. But what are those strong touchstones? I mean, I wrote another book about this back in 2001 called Searching for Certainty, and basically what we said was, what is Canadian? Well, it's a hat. It's like the Mountie Stetson. It's the maple leaf, and it's single payer healthcare. I mean, it's not like the start of the American preamble to the American Bill of Rights is. It's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's not that. I mean, our original founding thing was what we call peace, order, and good government. not exactly inspiring in the same way. And so those things are difficult. And one of the real difficulties with the Trudeau government was they never really celebrated Canada. They spent a lot of time apologizing for so many things. And so even, I've been talking about John A. Macdonald here because of his role in residential schools in the late 18th and early 19th century, early 20th and late 19th century. He'd been canceled in a lot of places, and the federal government had no difficulty with that, and would apologize and apologize and apologize and apologize for lots of things. Not saying that some of this wasn't due, but it kind of became almost obsessive. And things that were great in Canada in the past, they just wanted to get rid of them. The things that actually created the country. And not everything about this country is great. And there were things that need to be accommodated and explained and discussed, and in some instances apologized for. Even the Harper government was apologizing for certain things. And other governments have done the same thing in the past, whether it's, Japanese internment, what happened with the Jewish community at the start of the Second World War. I mean, there's lots of things that Canada looks back at, just as the United States looked back and says, these were not our finest moments we've had in Canada. But in the United States, they've also found a way to celebrate their finest moments. In Canada, Trudeau, our post-national prime minister, never really saw that as a great thing. It was all about the future. It was all about being part of the world. And all of that other stuff seemed very provincial to him and not very interesting and not really anything to celebrate. Well, if you can't do that, what does that mean to new immigrants? I mean, so it'll be interesting to see how the Carney government deals with that. But, the challenge of rebuilding Canadian identity is definitely one of those things. So when you look at this moment that we're in, Brad, that's why we call it breaking point. I mean, if we go back to that question, that fundamental question, are we a unique species on the North American continent? Well, we've got a lot of work to do to preserve it. Now, our view is that you can, but it's going to take a lot of effort.
For the Carney government, too, what lessons could they take from the Stephen Harper era?
The necessity of getting out of what the provincial governments are doing, giving them their space, letting them do what they need to do, and then treating their demands of the federal government seriously and trying to find a way to deliver on them. Fiscal prudence, managing the finances of the country well, celebrating Canadian history. Now, granted, Stephen Harper had kind of his own version of Canadian history. The things that he was really interested in, the North. He never seemed to be happier than when he was up north in, say, Tuktoyaktuk, or there's a mouthful for your audience. But he would be up north, and he almost seemed like he was free when he was up there. A different person than when he was in Ottawa. But he also celebrated a lot of Canadian history. So Canadian military history, you may have had a strange take on it, but he, some would argue, I actually don't think he had a strange take on it. I think it was a very valid take. Things like, for example, when the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812 rolled around, a war that Canadians argue that this country won, the military was given an 1812 pin to wear on their uniform. Battle honors that had not been granted by previous governments, progressive, conservative, and liberal, all of a sudden were granted to regiments in the Canadian Army. We had one of the latest statue that's been put on Parliament Hill was to the War of 1812. Put a whole new display of Canadian war heroes around the National Cenotaph in downtown Ottawa. These were all things that the Harper government would do because it cared about things like that. You can, in a million years, never imagine the Trudeau government ever doing that. Instead, they would do another apology about something. And so how can you make people who are new to the country feel good about the country if you think that everything that existed previously was bad? And so one of the things the Carney government can learn from the Harper government rather than the Trudeau government is to celebrate what's Canadian.
Yeah. Rewarding and celebrating those good things. That can go a long way. We've talked about several sort of interest groups within this discussion. One that seems to come up in some of your writing and other interviews I've heard is disaffected young men. And also in your book, you've written about Dr. Jordan Peterson, who has become sort of a voice for that group. How influential is Dr. Jordan Peterson in Canada in politics?
I think he's actually more influential in the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, he's Canadian. I think he's actually moved to the U.S. I think he was notable because he was exceptional in Canada, and his book did really well here in Canada. His 10 rules or 12 rules or whatever it was. But he's more of an international, I would say, presence than he is in a Canadian political presence. And I would say over time, his influence has waned in Canada. But yeah, not really. It's not like our prime minister's on the phone with Jordan Peterson.
He has interviewed some pretty high-level Canadian politicians.
Yeah, I interviewed Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah.
And this idea of pushing back on identity politics, Yeah, there is, you can see things moving back a bit in Canada. And maybe you could claim he was part of that. And I would say that, the situation for young men in this country, uh, well, it's not fashionable to say it. If you look at the statistics that are associated with the progress of young men in Canada, they are like they are in the United States. So, an inability to function within our educational system to the level of success of women have had. Their labor force participation is lower than it is for women. Their ability to form families and become fathers in decline, and just levels of suicide higher than they are for women. There's a lot that we have to ask about young men are feeling these days that Pierre Poilievre actually stood up and did ask, and which is why the group that he did best with in the election campaign was actually young men. So Jordan Peterson probably had some influence on some of this, but I think to the extent that it really became a thing in Canada, it was probably more Pierre Poilievre himself putting this together as a message.
So what impact does the decline of young men have on Canada?
Well, I think the decline of youth, I mean, they're the hope for the future, and it's young men and young women, but young men in particular, if we need to get back to doing the things that our economy is going to be successful in, and by the way, we're not like a northern version of Silicon Valley or anything. I mean, if you look at what we trade, I mean, anybody listening to this podcast, just go look at the monthly trade statistics from Statistics Canada, and you will see what drives the Canadian economy. Natural resources. Yes, there's some manufacturing categories there and others that are important to the Canadian economy, and particularly to some regions. But when you look at the overall totals, they are things in the natural resources industry. Those are things and occupations that a lot of young men traditionally, that's where they've been active. So we need them engaged in helping us create the next economy, just as we need young women engaged in the next economy. And there's a lot of young men who feel disaffected because they don't have the skills and they don't have the, maybe the education to succeed in whatever the version of the modern economy was that is not this natural resources economy, that they weren't succeeding as well as they should be. And, there's a narrative that, in many instances that, they're privileged and they don't know they're privileged. But when you go out and you talk to young men, they don't feel very privileged. So they're kicking off politically. We're seeing them as a big driver of populist movements all over the Western world. And it's no different in Canada.
Dr. Bricker, we've talked about different groups and things being sort of disaffected or down on Canada. Who do you think is really invested in the future of Canada?
Older Canadians. And which is the sad part, because there is basically what we're talking about here is what the past was. So they're the people who had their elbows up, and there's no better moment in the election campaign, federal election campaign, and your viewers can go find this online. And it is an ad that the Liberals ran right at the start of the election campaign. And it was with Mark Carney and Mike Myers, what was his name? Austin Powers.
Yeah.
At the start of they were in a fictitious hockey rink, and they were standing at the boards and they were talking in a very stilted fashion about being Canadian. And the things that they pointed to as symbols were things that I remember from my childhood, like TV shows that aren't on anymore, things that, kind of cliches for Canadians in their late 50s up into their 70s, not contemporary Canada whatsoever. That was that audience. That was the group that felt that Mark Carney was best representing them. They're the ones who, as I said before, who won as a result of the Canadian Promise. The Canadian Promise delivered for them. So who's invested in this current vision of Canada? That group.
The more we talk about this, the more it seems a bit of a catch-22 situation. The people who are older and aging out and things like that, and those are the people who are most invested. You bring in new people, but they don't see the promise paying out for them. You think there's hope?
Yeah, I do. I mean, we say in the last two chapters of the book that if people can make it there without, walking out and weeping, it's a light read. It's not a heavy. There's no charts or graphs. There's none of that. It's a narrative. And so the last two chapters are the crises of whatever it's called, whatever the right way of putting it around. So just cataloging, adding it all up and saying this is what it is. And then the last chapter is the big fix. And the big fix is our suggestion, a preliminary suggestion, not in any great detail, about the things that Canada needs to do in order to get back on track. And we start off with another great Canadian phrase from him. So George Grant, are we a unique species in the North American continent? Leonard Cohen, who said, there's a crack that lets the light in. We say that. And this moment, we're at a crack. There's a crack, and the light can come in. We face these situations in Canada today, but only when we faced them did we deal with them. So in the 1860s, during the referendum in 1980 and again in 1995, we faced these issues. And Canadians have shown an ability to come together and do big things in order to deal with this. I mean, we built a transcontinental railway, we built the St. Lawrence Seaway, built a highway network all across the country. We've, developed the oil sands in Alberta. We've developed so many amazing things in this country. Fought 2 world wars. We've done all of those things. So we've got the ability to do this. But only when we take those responsibilities, which are sovereign responsibilities, seriously. And what we've done is we've allowed too much of what are our sovereign responsibilities to go over to the United States, which is the point that Donald Trump is making. He's making exactly the point George Grant was making. Are you a unique species on the North American continent? Donald Trump's answer is no, you are not. Because you don't do the things that countries should do. So it's now time for us to do the things that countries should do. So that's what the last chapter of the book is about. And there are some very controversial things in there. Like, for example, breaking up the federal government in Ottawa, sending departments that aren't specifically, in the federal jurisdiction out to other parts of the country where they make more sense to be. You can't govern the country unless you live in it, we say in the book. Well, that's a pretty radical solution, but one I think we need to consider. Things that we need to do in culture in terms of our cultural communications and the way our media runs in this country. We have some strong suggestions on that. Some pretty strong suggestions on building of infrastructure and how we look at our economy and what it's going to be going forward. Some pretty strong views on what we should be doing with our military and our own sovereignty and how we should be positioning ourselves in the world. So these things are all there, not in any detailed programmatic way, but ticking boxes. And a big one is how we value the coming generations and how we help the Canadian dream work for them. So, for example, things like allowing some sort of wealth transfer from families to kids, so they can to make it far easier to buy houses. Taking a very radical approach, if you were talking to people who are in the urban planning game in this country, to the building of houses. Get out of the way, let the market do the job. And by the way, it's suburban. Sprawl, baby, sprawl. We've got to be doing that. That's not something that's going to be popular with the people who occupy this space in terms of policy discussion in this country. But it's time, because we're at this breaking point, to really seriously consider some of these things. So yeah, we don't leave it saying there's this, whole set of problems and walk away. We actually try to provide some direction as to where we should be going as a country.
Yeah. Let's talk some more about those economic and military situations. When it comes to the military, you wrote foreign policy is defense policy is trade policy. Knowing all that, what does Canada need to do as far as the military goes?
Well, if you don't have a strong military, you're not going to get to sit at the tables where these discussions take place about what the future of the world power blocks are going to be. I mean, we got left out of the UK, Australia, US submarine building program that the Australians got going, and their new grouping to talk about the Pacific and defense issues there. Canada should have naturally been at that table, but we weren't. Why? Well, because what do we have to offer? We've got 4 submarines, of which 1 is operational at any one time and 3 are in dry dock, being repaired or not operational, and we have a very hard time crewing any of them. I mean, this is why, because we've allowed the United States quite happily to take this over. And now, as I said, the cans have been kicked down the road and the chickens have come home to roost. So now we have to start doing things like our prime minister quite correctly was out talking to German submarine producers and Korean submarine producers about how we can purchase 12 submarines to meet our national security requirements in this country. Well, yes, that's what we need to do. I saw a plan that was leaked the other day about how to increase our reserves up to 400,000, which, by the way, our current reserve force is about 28,000 in this country. So that's a huge target. But how do we get Canadians more interested in being part of what happens in terms of protecting our own security? Because you got to be able to defend the country. So, these things are starting to come up, and kudos to the government for raising them, because these are the kinds of challenges that we have to take on. But yeah, we just don't leave it as, as just there's all these problems. So let me just finish, because you did ask a specific question, which was defense policy equals foreign policy equals trade policy. All true. You can't be taken seriously on any of those other 2 things unless you stand up in terms of being able to defend and participate in global defense.
It seems Canada is aware of the geographical position that they hold. in relation to things, Russia and such, and global warming perhaps changing even waterways? How does Canada's geography play out for their military?
Well, the North is contested. So China's quite aggressively building its own icebreaker fleet. The Russians are building new bases up there. Canada now has to seriously consider what it's going to put up there, because if we don't do it, the Americans will do it for us. And if the Americans do it for us, who owns the North?
Yeah, that says it all.
We're the true North, strong and free.
And that's something to rally around too.
Yes.
Some of this
Stephen
seems to
Harper,
be about
this
having
was
an
his
issue.
thing. This was his thing. But then again, didn't really do anything. I mean,
That was a Stephen Harper thing.
Yeah, well, goes all the way back to John Diefenbaker. He was the prime minister in the late 50s, early 60s, and the North was a big part of how he looked at the country. But the difference now is it's now no longer a frozen wasteland. With climate change, we're going to get access to all sorts of potential oil and gas, potential critical minerals, all sorts of things that are going to be available in terms of what our economy can prosper from. But if the Chinese and the Russians are up there owning it, or the Americans go in because they don't think that we're doing the job that needs to be done to protect against China. And by the way, it shouldn't be the Americans deciding the job is being done, it's us. And so we need to put together the capability to be able to do that. Prime Minister knows that, and that's why we're seeing these things happen. And that's why one of the big spending increase areas in the budget that's going to be put out today is defense. It's already been announced.
Darrell Bricker, before we get to our last topic, where's the best place for people to look for you online?
Probably on X, I'm there, but also Global TV a lot here in Canada, but I'm all over the place. I'm pretty easy to find.
And we'll put a link to your newest book, Breaking Point, in the description for people to check out as well. And our last topic, kind of back where we started, natural resources, things like Alberta being so resource rich. How do you see, knowing that Canada is so resource rich, how do you see that playing out in future strategy?
Well, I think that it's a moment of truth telling. So there was a Canadian economist, political economist back in the 90s, Harold Anazinis at the University of Toronto, I think it was the 40s, might have been the 50s, who referred to us as hewers of wood and drawers of water. And that is the truth. And for the last 10 years, we've basically been embarrassed about that. So we've had a federal government who's been talking about technology superclusters and green energy and all this other stuff, which is really important because we've got to go through some of these transitions, absolutely. But did everything that they could to restrict exploiting any natural resources, because we were going to move to this new sort of green futuristic type of economy. And it's worked out for us exactly as one would anticipate. What the world wants from Canada are things that we should not be embarrassed about, which are our natural resources. Now, yes, we can do them in a green way. We can do them in greener ways than other parts of the world can do. And we can go through green transition, but our wealth is not going to be in artificial intelligence like in Silicon Valley. I mean, we can maybe participate in that to a certain extent, but what we need to do is find more markets for the things that we have in this country. And that's what will drive the future of our economy. I mean, what's particularly scary for the province that I live in, I'm speaking to you from Toronto today, and I live in Ontario, is a big chunk of our provincial economy is automotive production. And looking at what's happening in the United States right now, one has to be concerned about what's going to happen with the automotive industry here in this part of the country. And so what do we have to fall back on after that? Not very much. So natural resources, and Ontario even has a big north too, right? We have something here called the Ring of Fire, which is all sorts of mineral deposits that we could take advantage of. But that's not the Justin Trudeau economy. He was never interested in that. I was kind of embarrassed about it. Agriculture is huge in Canada. What does our government do, federal government do for agriculture in terms of making it part of its industrial strategy? And the answer is next to nothing. Again, we're sort of embarrassed by it. So I think that Mark Carney and his current version of the Liberal Party is waking up to the realities of what it is that we really are, because we can no longer pretend under an American umbrella that we're maybe more virtuous than the United States, but we're actually economically dependent on them. What we need to do now is realize what our economic advantages are. And that is the crack that brings the light in, right? And understanding that that's going to be our economic future for the foreseeable future.
So if the economic future is in these resources, and it seems perhaps easiest to sell those resources to the U.S., but Canada wants to maintain independence from the U.S., what's the step there?
Well, the only thing that we can do is we have to diversify our markets, which is why the Prime Minister is going around the world trying to do that. And there are all sorts of countries that would be interested in having access to our natural resources, particularly oil and gas. But the federal government in this country under the Trudeau administration was not interested in increasing exports, increasing the exploitation of those resources here in the country. Now, they did build the TMX pipeline, which was a good thing, but they blocked other pipelines. And they really saw this as very much a sunset industry and announced that several times. Because of what's going on in the United States, the truth has become blindingly clear that we're going to have to figure out a way to get some of those resources, a much greater proportion of those resources to markets other than the U.S.
To Darrell Bricker, for looking at those places that the light is shining on through those cracks, and for writing about it and educating the rest of us about it, and for taking this interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brad. Really appreciate it.